that lets everything more or less stay in focus. That's a pretty good trick, isn't it? It's an unusual project, and I think what appealed to Clint about it is it's just sort of this roll of the dice where ordinary people end up in extraordinary circumstances and sometimes do remarkable things. He had this idea that this would be an interesting thing to do, so that's what we set out to do. It seemed to me the story of 1517 to Paris were these three American guys, which in sort of in a European sense, you'd say they don't have any education. And I mean, they didn't have the benefit education. They were sort of like just real average guys. And you could almost use the term banal. That's what I set out to try to establish, was sort of just an everyday thing. And the train is kind of hard to do. Really not much room to have shadows. There are no tunnels and there's no, it was in daytime, so. Well, it's sort of anti-dramatic is what I guess how I'd characterize it, at least the part before the train. That's what the story was about, and that's what we did. The basic thing about Clint is he's an actor, probably first and foremost, although he wouldn't admit it today, but that's his background. So the way he likes to run his operation is that it's sort of the actor's performance is primordial first. And that's my responsibility is more or less to try to make all the technical stuff go away. So it's really great if the cameras always work. And it's like really good if stuff's in focus. And it's really good if we don't have to have reshoot. So all of which is pretty simple and pretty logical if you think about it, if those are your goals. I think our young friends had no idea that we were shooting. There are no open walkie-talkies, so you don't hear anything. So it's all little earpieces for people that have to have them. And the AD never says, quiet on the set, never. And Clint will say, go. And it goes. And then Clint will say, stop, and it stops. And then a lot of times Clint will kind of look at, he'll start to like do one of these things, and he'll do one of these, and then I'll do one of these, and then we're rolling. So that's what we call quiet roll, but we'll be rolling and nobody knows. The mixer knows it because he's recording sound, and the first assistant knows it because he's doing focus. But the actors don't particularly know it. They may start to realize it halfway through. That's just priorities again. If you want to make it a temple of like cameras and lenses and filters and stuff, you can do that. Or if you want to make it about performance, you do that. It's funny because when you mention happy accidents, there's an English word for it, which is serendipity. But Clint feels, I think, that when somebody first approaches something, there's a freshness and an honesty, and they try to decode what they need to do and think about it and act and reflect, and that's what he liked. So it came in very, very handy on 1517 to Paris because these people were not, what would you say, experienced. And so that we just want to remove as many distractions as possible. I was sitting here at home, and this project was sort of bubbling around, and the phone rings. It's Clint. He's like, hey, how you doing? He says, well, what do you think about shooting this on a real train? And I said, Clint, I think it'd be fantastic. It's a brilliant idea. And there's like a long pause because he knows I'm bullshitting him. Why is that? He says, well, you know how much I like short days, and the train from Brussels to Paris is an hour and 22 minutes. I can't do any better than that. There's this long pause where he started getting ready to be pissed off, but he's like, he said, well, maybe the train could go a little slower. There's a couple challenges about shooting on a real train, but I think I'm sure we can overcome the challenges, and if that's what you'd like to do, then let's do it. So we were shooting at 297 kilometers an hour, and basically Thales, which is the consortium of French, Belgian, Dutch, German that operate the trains, were just absolutely golden princes, fantastically helpful. And we were able to integrate our train into all the traffic flow in Europe, and it's like a monster job for them. Yeah, and the trick is, there's a little bit of a screen direction trick that you had to be careful of, because we were supposed to be going south. So we weren't always going south, but we dealt with it. There was absolutely no green screen, because green screen makes Clint's eyes roll to the back of his head. So for me personally, it doesn't make, green screen's a little boring, but it's a perfectly good tool, and it's like, I got no problem with it. But Clint would prefer not to, although there were a couple of sequences where we would start in the sequence and then the train pulled in the station, and he liked the performance, except the train wasn't moving. But other than that, there was really no green screen. It was all, little bits we did with rotoscope. We figured, we basically had to overhaul all the lighting to get as much ambient light in there as we could. And then I figured out the route every day to figure out which side the sun was going to be coming in from. And then we were fortunate with the weather. It was generally kind of overcast. We were considered to be an attractive target. So every morning the trains were swept with explosive sniffing dogs. And so once we were on, that was it, we were on, because they didn't want any problems. So we had to be sure to have everything we needed on the train for the day. There's space problems because of the velocity. It was deemed unsafe to demount any of the seats because it's a structural integral deal. So we ended up using, in fact, this particular camera and lens. So we used the CP3s on a Sony to say we were up against a wall or something like that. It just ended up being sort of the shortest optical capture unit that we could imagine that was of high quality. And that worked out very, very well. And the other thing about a train, because it's moving, if you're holding a camera that has a lot of mass, it becomes very difficult to hold it still. Whereas this situation ended up being very well adapted to things like the fighting and such like that. And you can immediately get it under a train seat. If I couldn't come up with a small camera, then Clint was going to say to me, get out the Blackmagic pocket camera that we used on American Sniper. And so I was looking for something as small as possible that was acceptable, which is why I didn't put master anamorphics on the Sony. I mean, then we'd have the adapter and by the time it just would be too big. And the other little deal is when all this stuff is going on, what I've discovered, with enough motion blur and activity going on, we tend to get into like a 4.56. So if you're at a 4.56 with an 18mm spherical lens, you've got some room. And that lets everything more or less stay in focus. That's a pretty good trick, isn't it? The CP3s were not, just out of the box, not a bad match. It wasn't hopelessly far away. And traditionally with Clint likes the 2:3:5 aspect ratio. And I had used the master anamorphics on this prior Warner Brothers film in New Zealand. and liked them a lot. And that we just needed to come up with some sort of lens that we could use in a small space. And that's where we decided to use the CP3s, because it just let us get a little bit smaller. And we basically created a reticle so we could extract the widescreen image out of it. And most of the CP3 stuff had a certain amount of a kind of dynamic component to it. So there's a little bit of motion blur and things like that, so it would be easy to hide.